Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at the beginning of the French Revolution. Just as a reminder, remember from the last lesson we talked about the American Revolution. We discussed how colonial empires had emerged in the Americas and in the Western Hemisphere. We talked about how the Enlightenment ideas influenced all of these things. And now we're going to look at what happens in France. Now, the key thing about what you need to know is that um, although the American Revolution was a big success because it showed that a absolute monarch could be overthrown, this hadn't really happened in Europe. So this is the big difference. That no one had really tried to overthrow a powerful absolute monarch in Europe. So the French Revolution is the beginning of that, and it's also going to help propel other revolutions, not only in Europe but in the Americas as well. So the French Revolution has a very big, lasting impact on the entire world. As always, our learning objectives, we have 4 of them for this lesson. What were the 3 causes of the French Revolution? Explain the differences between the 3 estates. Explain the beginnings of the revolution. And number 4, explain the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So those are going to be our 4 main learning objectives. If you want to take a second and write those down, pause the video, and then once you're done writing those down, then you can continue on. Okay, so let's look at what was going on in France. Well, one of the first things is class warfare. And what does that actually mean? Well, you had a social structure set up in France where you had 3 different classes or 3 different estates, and we're going to get into that. You have a conflict between social or economic classes in France, between the haves and the have-nots, between the people that are considered the bottom of the barrel and people considered to be at the top. So you have class warfare going on in France. Rich versus poor was a good way to put it as well. You also are dealing with the idea of absolute monarchy, which we've discussed already. Remember the divine right of kings, and these people feel like they've been given the right to rule by God. A king or queen whose power is not limited by any laws or constitution. So again, that's the definition for absolute monarchy. So another one of the things that was going on in Europe and in France. You had people that were exempt from paying taxes. That was another thing that was going on in France. The main tax in France was called the taille. It was a direct tax on French commoners, mainly the Third Estate, and we're going to discuss that in just a second. You also had a middle class known as the bourgeoisie. Again, these were the merchants, the peasants were considered in the Third Estate along with the bourgeoisie, but the middle class is mainly the business class, the bankers, merchants, artists, and so on would all be considered in the bourgeoisie. You also had the idea of a limited monarchy, which was starting to emerge in Europe. Remember, we talked about the Glorious Revolution and how the Parliament had gained power after the Glorious Revolution. But in a limited monarchy, the king is still the head of the government, but has to follow the laws of a constitution. So again, these were all things that were going on during this period leading up to the beginning of the French Revolution. So 1789 is considered a very important year for a couple of reasons. The first reason is the Constitution of the United States was ratified in 1789, which was using those ideas of the Enlightenment. It's also the beginning of the French Revolution. That's when the French Revolution starts in 1789. There are 3 main causes of the French Revolution. You definitely want to know these, as this is one of our learning objective questions. This included a sharp class divide between the first 2 estates and the Third Estate, and this is going to lead to class warfare, and we're going to talk about who's in each one of those estates in just a second. Again, you had an absolute monarch in Louis XVI, who is going to abuse his powers, mainly living a very extravagant lifestyle and spending a lot of money on wars. And you're going to have an economic crisis. France is in a lot of debt, mainly due to Louis' extravagant spending, as well as the wars in America with the American Revolution, the 7 Years' War, and other wars that were being fought in Europe. So let's look at the three estates. In the first estate, you mainly had the clergy. Clergy are church members. 130,000 people are considered to be in the first estate during this time. That's less than 1% of the entire French population. The first estate was also exempt from paying the taille, which was the tax, the main tax in France. Then you had the second estate. And the second estate was mainly made up of the nobility, the rich, the wealthy, the large landowners. 350,000 people were in the second estate, again, less than 2% of the entire French population. They had powerful positions, not only in the church, but also in the government and the military. Once again, they were also exempt from paying the main French tax, which was the taille. And then the final estate is the third estate. The third estate was the largest estate. The majority of the people in the third estate were peasants, but it also included the middle class or the bourgeoisie. You also had skilled peoples, craftsmen, and shopkeepers as well. Again, the bourgeoisie was included in the third estate. This was mainly made up of merchants, bankers, industrialists, lawyers, and doctors. This shows you a breakdown of the three estates. You can see the first estate being in green. They are the clergy. They own 10% of the land. The second estate, 25% of the land. You can see over here, this is the population breakdown. The first estate was less than or almost 0.5%, and the second estate was 1.5%, making 2% of the entire population. The third estate, 98% of the population, 65% of the land ownership, and 100% of the taxation. So you can see how things were very, very unfair for the third estate. So let's look at the beginning of the revolution. Louis realizes that he is facing a lot of problems, and so he's going to call for a meeting known as the Estates General. States General hadn't been called together for over 150 years. Louis realizes that he's in trouble, so he calls for a meeting to discuss taxation and to figure out how he was going to solve the debt problem. Each estate in the Estates General had one vote. So the first estate had one vote, the second estate had one vote, and the third estate had one vote. But because it was so lopsided, the first two estates could always outvote the third estate, even though the third estate represented the most people. Again, the majority of the people or the majority of the population is in the third estate, and a lot of times they're the ones who get the shaft. They're the ones who take the hit. On May 5th, 1789, the Third Estate refused to meet until this voting system was changed. The Third Estate is going to create their own government known as the National Assembly. They agreed to meet at the tennis courts, and they make an oath or a pledge at the tennis courts on June 1789. What was that oath? The oath was to decide that they would continue to meet until a new constitution was written for the country of France. So that is the tennis court oath. Eventually, the revolution is going to spread. The Third Estate has created the National Assembly. Once Jacques Necker is dismissed, he's the finance minister for King Louis XVI. He was liked by a lot of people because he was very transparent. He showed where the money was being spent. But Louis decides to get rid of Jacques Necker, and this causes problems. This is when the Third Estate and the people of Paris rebel against the government. So on July 14th, 1789, the people of Paris are going to capture and destroy a prison known as the Bastille. And you can see a picture of the Bastille down here at the bottom of the slide. The Bastille was a symbol of the king's oppression because he locked up many of the political prisoners there. And it also contained weapons and guns. So naturally, it was going to be a target for the revolutionaries. This event today is still recognized as France's national holiday, and it's called Bastille Day. Shortly after the storming of the Bastille, we get the writing of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, very similar to the Declaration of Independence. August 26, 1789, this document was adopted by the National Assembly. What did it do? It ended exemption from taxes and special privileges for the first two estates. And again, this is going back to one of your learning objective questions, so we're answering that question at this point. It also gave freedom of religion, press, and equal rights and fair trials to the people of France. It also created a limited monarchy where the government would be limited by a constitution. Once the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen is put into play, Louis XVI is going to be hiding out at Versailles, which is the palace, remember, that was built by Louis XIV, remember, the Sun King. And he's really not wanting to do much about what's going on. He's sort of ignoring it at this point. But the people are going to have none of this. There's going to be a huge march by these women that you see down here at the bottom, mainly over bread. It's often referred to as the Women's March. The women that are going to be involved are going to be the women of the streets, mainly women that actually cut fish. They sold them in the market, and they're really upset by all of this. And so they're going to go to Versailles, and they're going to capture Louis XVI and his family, and they're going to bring him back to Paris, where he would remain sort of a prisoner for the rest of his life. The other question was, once this happens, what are they going to do with the king? And eventually Louis XVI is going to be accused of treason, and he's going to be put under the guillotine, which we're going to be talking about in the next lesson, and he is beheaded in 1793. The guillotine is often referred to as the national razor. Okay, that's going to do it for this first lesson. We'll look at radical revolution and reaction in section 2. Okay, please make sure you go back and you answer your learning objective questions. Make sure that you fill those in before you turn in your notes. Okay, I'll catch you guys on the next one.